And without further ado, I have the real great pleasure and honor of introducing our keynote speaker at today's UNESCO-Chairs panel, Dr. Rajesh Tandon. For many, and certainly for me, Dr. Tandon needs absolutely no introduction. He is the founder of PRIA, Participatory Research in Asia, which I was told is currently celebrating 40 years as a global research and training center. Dr. Tandon is also UNESCO Chair in Community-Based Research and Social Responsibility in Higher Education, and will be speaking today, colleagues, on the all-important topic of social responsibility of higher education increases post-pandemic. I won't come in the way of the audience listening to Dr. Tandon's inspiring comments any longer. So over to you, Dr. Tandon. We're all full of attention and looking forward to hearing your comments.
Thank you, Aditya. Thank you so much for your very thoughtful overview of the Association of Commonwealth Universities. And I have had and continue to have strong and mutually beneficial partnership with many colleagues of the association over the last 2 decades. Special thanks to Dr. Mausumi Mukherjee for inviting me, Professor Rajkumar for inviting me, and hosting this very interesting and important, timely conversation on the positioning, contribution, and the future of higher education in all our societies. So namaskar and good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We are learned to be in different parts of the world, but simultaneously connected. So thank you very much for this occasion. Over the last 18 months or so, the pandemic is a significant impact on all our lives, all our work, all our societies, all our communities. It is the single largest impact which is universal, and in a particular way, it has affected educational institutions. The lockdowns, the restrictions, the inability to continue learning for students, continue teaching for teachers, continue research for researchers, has had enormous impact already. Much has been written about it, much has been talked about it. What does it tell us about the future, and how can we position our work and our institutions as we move ahead? The first thing to recognize is that teaching and learning suddenly got disrupted. We shut down university campuses, hostels, classrooms, research labs, and what was a natural and assumed practice of collaboration between learners and teachers, between researchers, between academics, and that natural process disrupted learning for all. It disrupted the process, and unfortunately, the disruption has continued for a very long time. Many young people have lost a whole academic year, if not year and a half, trying to cope with it. And while we have produced temporary solutions on online learning, many of our institutions were not equipped to be able to do so adequately. Many of our institutions lack the digital infrastructure. They lack capacities among teachers to facilitate teaching and learning. And more importantly, many of our students lack that. 2 days ago, Dr. Sona Jharia Minj, who is a computer science professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi, recently appointed last year as first indigenous woman vice chancellor of Sodo Kanu Murmu University in Dumka in Jharkhand, and a university which covers 7 districts and 50 affiliated colleges, including teacher training colleges. She was in our office 2 days ago, and in the interaction narrated her data sciences experience. They invited students last fall, sometime around this time last year, to fill a form saying, would you prefer to take online exam or not? And she said that only 9% said they can do so. Others had no confidence in their technological access as well as capacity to be able to give their exam. And this is a region which is comprising of our tribal students, predominantly indigenous students, and therefore is an example of how we need to pay attention to the disruption in their learning. The second phenomena that almost paralleled the pandemic and was brought to our attention last month in Glasgow is the report and deliberation of COP26. Despite being at home and trying to study from home, we all also witnessed phenomena of climate impact: droughts, floods, cyclones, heat waves, fires. And this has happened in the Indian subcontinent as well, all of these. And it has happened with greater intensity and impacting more and more people. So how do we then prepare higher education as well as higher education institutions going forward, keeping in view that both the health pandemic and other climate pandemics are here to stay? They are a part of our life, and we need to figure out to minimize their impact, become more resilient, and look forward to a new way of moving our communities and societies in the next decade. This is where I think higher education institutions have enormous responsibility, and I call it social responsibility. Because unless we view this responsibility in a societal framework, just viewing it at the institutional level or at the disciplinary level, oh, sociology, physics, electrical engineering, that's not enough. The entire system of higher education has to become, in every decision it makes, socially responsible. And I want to present to you a few pathways towards that as I understand them. The first pathway is to figure out more supportive, what I call hybridization of learning process. All studies have shown that mere online teaching and learning will not produce the kind of capacities, competencies, skills that our young people have. And therefore, what does hybridization mean? There is no single method of hybridization. But what form, contextually relevant, for which set of students, how much of face-to-face? And remember that it is not just individual learning by each student. We are talking about social interaction and a social space, and a lot of it is learning together. In fact, conversations, all of us have gone through higher education, conversations in university cafeteria and in the hostels at night are as educative as what we did in the classroom. So how do we create models and approaches of hybridization of learning, accepting online reality, but not treating it as panacea, and figuring out contextually appropriate answers instead of a universal 70% online, 30% face-to-face? No, contextually relevant, discipline relevant, categories of student will require different responses. The second pathway, never before, the demand for multidisciplinarity from COP26, from the pandemic, from SDGs, all is hitting us. And we have to stop talking about it and start doing something about it. We have to, I know that JGU is a great example. Professor Raj always keeps telling how all the disciplines and faculties have been intermixed, even in the physical infrastructure. And that's a very good step forward. But that is not the reality around the world in higher education institutions. I think disciplinary, uh, you know, emeritus leaders who are valued around the world for their disciplinary knowledge and excellence, who are in some ways disciplinary gatekeepers also of what should be taught and what not should be taught. They need to shed, they need to let go of that individual view of the subject matter and look at it from the world we are living in and likely to live in. From a societal point of view, none of the SDGs can be implemented within a discipline. SDG 3 is not about medical sciences. The pandemic has shown it very clearly. This morning, I was having a conversation with colleagues from slums of Mumbai, and still a good 20% of the slum population has not been vaccinated. It is not because they don't want it, it is because the social psychology and the economics of getting vaccinated hasn't been understood. And that you cannot learn only by attending a class on anatomy or epidemiology. You need to therefore work together across disciplines. And we have to therefore shed that disciplinary silos. Never before. None of our challenges going forward require only a solo discipline solution. And this is the demand of the time. And I hope we all figure it out practically how to do it from the point of view of finding knowledge solutions for society that we are in. A third and related pathway is to prepare a set of young professionals who graduate from our institutions who are sensitive to these challenges, who understand exclusion, who understand inequality, who understand the impacts of climate, not just from the point of view of mitigation, but day-to-day adaptation that vulnerable communities are doing. Because civil engineers of tomorrow need to understand what is it that will make climate resilient buildings. And that needs to be taught today. In fact, should have been taught yesterday through the curriculum changes. I know in many academic institutions, the system of changing curriculum and coursework could take years. But friends, we have run out of time. We must do it urgently. I want the next batch of civil engineers graduating next year to be totally tuned to the requirement of climate impact in order to design the materials and the infrastructure that all our societies need. But it cannot be business as usual. And so they are the ones who will be the torchbearers of that change. We need civil engineers, but we need a new genre of professionals. We need new genre of management graduates, economists. You know, the logic of global economy of scale has fallen apart in the pandemic. The global supply chain has been so thoroughly disrupted that even today we cannot find tomatoes in Kerala or chips for making mobiles in India. So let us rethink our disciplines, but from the point of view of preparing a new genre of professionals who are responsive. And this is a socially responsible task. It is not a disciplinary task. It's not just an academic task. It's a task to be responsive to society. And I want all of us to frame it in that way in our own head so that we don't get stuck in the niceties and formalities of our disciplinary boundaries. The fourth part is, you know, a lot of higher education institutions are already doing a great deal of work in preparation of SDGs and in looking after the climate issues. But increasingly, the world has recognized that there is no one solution that fits all, even one knowledge solution that fits all. So how do we prepare universities to learn to do contextually relevant, partnership-driven research, which produces knowledge solutions which can be owned by various stakeholders in order to move forward. So what Dr. Mins was telling me about Dumka 2 days ago was she is looking at how tribal Santhali students in our colleges and university can learn to look at communities, indigenous communities of that region as sources of knowledge, not as stupid, ignorant people. And that requires reorientation inside the academia. She wants that reorientation to happen in a university and in those 50 colleges affiliated to the university. And that reorientation means you respect the knowledge which is in society, you accept that that is not adequate, community also accept, but you build on it. You don't devalue it, you don't dismiss it. And that's the only way our students and researchers will be able to produce locally, contextually actionable knowledge in response to ongoing impacts of climate, in response to finding specific solutions for various SDGs as locally appropriate. And finally, a pathway that occurs to me is that, universities used to have in the old British model a department called extension, and sort of extramural extension, basically a section of taking universities' expertise into the community. And later on, that part became, continuing education. We will offer some courses for those fellows who didn't make it in the university system, etc. But I think now is the time to frame higher education integrally in a lifelong learning framework. To look at higher education not as a one-time delivery of 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, whatever, but a catalyzer of sustained learning throughout life. Learning throughout life, learning from all aspects of life. And therefore, it is not just those who have dropped out of the university or who could not make it who need this extension. In fact, extension is a derogatory concept. You need opportunities to learn. You need opportunity, but also those who need reskilling, rethinking. The task of reskilling, if you just take the example I gave, because I come from engineering background, I gave you that. The task of reskilling, reorienting the thinking of millions of civil engineers, because they are working today, but their curriculum did not prepare them to understand climate impact of the materials they use and the designs they create. It's huge. It's huge. And this is a social responsibility of higher education institutions to frame their teaching research in the context of lifelong learning. Today, we have a number of supports for these pathways, which did not exist, interestingly enough, 2 years ago before the pandemic began. First and foremost, in a country like India, we have National Education Policy last July 2020. The policy speaks exactly to all the issues that I've just presented to you. It talks about learning from the society. It talks about contributing your knowledge to society. It talks about lifelong learning framework. It talks about preparing ethical, committed, passionate professionals who view society as part of. So higher education institutions in India can gather great deal of support from this policy, and people who champion this approach, like Professor Raj, like Dr. Mukherjee, and all of us, we can get policy support, and gradually the policy support will translate into resource support, I am sure. So this is one thing which did not happen, wasn't available to us at the beginning of the pandemic. The second thing that has happened, last month, UNESCO has taken two really forward-looking steps. Firstly, UNESCO's report on futures of education has been released. Those of you who have not taken a look, please do. It is a forward-looking. First of all, it does not say the future. It says futures, plurality. So learning, education has plural pathways. Let us respect them. Let us not rank them vertically, one better than another. Let's place them horizontally. and they move simultaneously. The Futures of Education report also talks about valuing learning at all stages of life and therefore linking the higher education system within the framework of lifelong learning. That's a wonderful recognition. All our national governments have agreed to that, and they value what Futures of Education Commission report is talking about. Let us unpack it so that we can argue in our institutions, in our countries, in our classrooms, that this is how we are reorganizing our work of teaching, learning, research, and engagement within this framework. And the third thing which has happened last month in UNESCO is also equally futuristic. All the countries of the world who are members of UNESCO have agreed to a set of recommendations called open science. What does open science mean? Science which is open to society, not just to scientists. It is not just about open data. Last 2 years, for the pandemic research, there have been discussions about who shares research data, who doesn't share it. That's important, but that's basic. Science which is open to society to share its findings with society. Throughout the pandemic, it is not just the epidemiologists or scientists doing research on the virus who needed to share data, but frontline workers providing support to communities in coping with the pandemic also needed scientific knowledge, communicated in a manner that is understandable. This whole debate of fake news or confusion or vaccine hesitancy is all a consequence of science not engaging society directly. And the third element in this is science which is open to multiple cultures and epistemologies of knowledge system. This is the mandate of open science. All our countries are signatories to it. India is going to produce its own new policy on science, technology, and innovation, and its opening chapter on open science, I'm sure, will be informed by these principles. So this is an opportunity. These policy mandates, global policy mandates, UNESCO-driven mandates, as well as the national education policy, provide us great opportunity to pursue changes in our higher education institutions such that every act in our institutions, teaching, research, engagement, is viewed from a socially responsible act. I believe that higher education is a public good. It must serve public purpose. Of course, it builds our individual careers. Individual careers have no future without the context in which we live and work. And therefore, let us make higher education with and for society in a socially responsible manner. Thank you very much for your patience. Look forward to your comments.